First actual colloquium of the spring semester. I know we were supposed to have one last week, but as you were all aware of Snowpocalypse, that was unfortunately had to be rescheduled. But Les Apprentice will hopefully be joining us next year, so we'll keep you posted on that. It's nice to see you all. I am so excited to present today's colloquium speaker, Professor Dan Miller, who is the Coyle Mission Collegiate Associate Professor in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Dan works on sort of environmental politics internationally, international aid, conservation, a wide range of topics, and is a really fantastic sort of integration of development, ecology, forestry, used to be a forester at the World Bank, which is kind of amazing as well, is widely published. I'm not going to go into the long list of outlets that Professor Miller published in. I have the distinct pleasure of actually having been at grad school with Dan years and years and years ago. So it is wonderful to have him back. He's a long history with the workshop with Lynn, Arun Agrawal, and others. So I'm really delighted to have him here presenting his work on funding long enduring biodiversity conservation, on his work recently in Peru, but also in West Africa. He's been around the world working on these things. Before I let him take over, I just want to remind everybody, Wednesday we have our research series where Bill Bloomquist and Cindy Lott will be talking about Philanthropy Commons and their sort of new working group in that area. So please join us for that. We don't have lunch, but we have cookies. So hopefully that's enticing enough. But without further ado, I'm gonna let Dan take over. Just a reminder, right? Clarifying questions throughout the course of the presentation, and then we'll sort of launch into discussion, which will hopefully be the first question will come from a grad student at the end of his presentation. All right. It's nice to see you all. Welcome, Dan.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jessica, and thanks to all of you for being here. Really a pleasure to be back here. Yeah, I think the last time I was here was actually for Vincent and Lynn's memorial service. So 2012, something like that. It's great to be back. I'm sorry it took so long. So today, as Jessica mentioned, I wanted to focus on funding of biodiversity conservation. I wanted to choose a topic that is kind of on the edge of what I'm doing. So give me that this is like all work in progress. So we'll see how it goes, kind of road testing it with you all. And then the end, I had grand ambitions to like come up with, here's where I want to go. Actually propose some principles and like a very specific framework based on work that I've been doing over the last 5 years through the pandemic with a number of colleagues on philanthropy. I wish I was staying till Wednesday for that group. Sounds really great, that Philanthropy Commons idea. So we had funding from the MacArthur Foundation to do a lot of the work that I'm presenting to you. And I'd hoped to get farther here. But since we're in, en famille, in family here, having our meal, I thought maybe we could work on some of these topics together toward the end. So that's the kind of roadmap for today. And I'll just briefly say a little bit more about myself. I looked, I think it's in some hard drive somewhere, but all of my old pictures with Lynn and being here in the early 2000s. The closest I could do was this sort of, Lynn was sitting like over here at this table. So this is some younger version of myself when I worked at the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago in this building. And Lynn, so MacArthur was one of the early funders of IFRI, National Forestry Research Resources and Institutions Network. And I had the privilege of being the kind of program officer connection with IFRI, and that's how I got to know her. We subsequently invited her to help develop and design a research group on advancing conservation in a social context. So I came down here for WOW in I think 2004 or something like that. Long history, and I was just reflective about how much she meant to me in my whole, I literally would not be standing here were it not for her. Even though I wasn't her student, I'm kind of her intellectual grandson, I think is what it is. Because Arun Agrawal was my PhD advisor, was her student. So really, it's a pleasure. And the issues that I'm talking about today have been sort of percolating from that time. And it was really Lynn. I remember very distinctly a conversation at WOW in her driveway outside of their house, like saying, yeah, you should go do your PhD. I'll support you in that. My wife went to Michigan, so therefore I went to Michigan and not IU. Anyway, it was great to work with Arun and keep up with Lynn. So what have I been up to and trying to think about since those days? I mean, this is like the big research question that animates pretty much everything that I do. This challenge of conserving biodiversity, stabilizing the climate, but doing so in a way that doesn't leave some of the most disadvantaged among us. Some of the kids that I lived with in Niger during my PhD field research, more and worse off. So the big question. This is probably well familiar to you in this room. I would love to see an update of this. I was looking at it this morning, and you have, the red areas are where you have a high sort of threatened species biodiversity importance with high poverty in yellow, but the purple is really where the focus of a lot of my research has been. But I was looking, high poverty in China and elsewhere, in the Amazon and in Brazil. I bet that's changed quite a bit in 15 plus years since this was done. But I think probably the general patterns along the topics are probably similar. In parallel, again, I'd love to see an update on this, particularly some of the government effectiveness indicators in countries that used to be blue or maybe less these days. But I'm sure there's change. But I like this kind of pairing of, in this case, global mammal conservation priorities with worldwide governance indicators of governance effectiveness. And this shows peaks in priorities for conservation, but a valley in terms of governance effectiveness. And so this kind of it gives reason for my research focusing on governance and aid, and three big questions that I'll get more into. But, what are the impacts? And I think if I reflect on learning from Lynn and Vincent in the workshop, a lot of it is focused on process or on policy outcomes, like policy as an outcome. Not as much, although there is still a lot on outcomes on ecological and social kind of on the ground. So I'm interested in those ultimate impacts, as well as especially their synergies and trade-offs, and then the pathways. So in our group, I try to conceptualize my research as kind of following along this continuum and then looping back, but trying to understand funder decision-making processes. As Jessica mentioned, I first worked at MacArthur Foundation. That was after working with an indigenous community NGO in Borneo for a couple of years. And then after my PhD, I really wanted to be a professor, but I was fortunate to get a job at the World Bank as a senior forestry specialist. But I left after a couple of years to be a professor, which is happier doing that. So trying to understand how decision funders like the World Bank or MacArthur, how do they decide what to do? Then what actually happens? How are the funds allocated? Empirically kind of mapping that out, also building theory around how they do it, and then looking on the ground at implementation and adoption of different technologies, and then to ultimate impacts. Of course, none of that happens in a vacuum. So we have to attend to physical, social, ecological, political context. So one final thing, we're going into the Peru case. I'm also the coordinator of the FLAIR network, or Forests and Livelihoods. Are any of you members of FLAIR? I think some of you are kind of ish, maybe, or it's, you're all invited. So that's really a legacy of Lynn's work with IFRI. So Arun Agrawal founded FLAIR more than a decade ago as kind of a community of practice. And in a way, some ways it's superseded IFRI. And IFRI is now kind of a part of FLAIR. FLAIR is a much broader network, but I'd love to talk with any of you that are interested about kind of the next phase of FLAIR. We're embarking on a strategic planning process. And I think we need to go back to basics in some way and see what IFRI 2.0 might look like, kind of marshaling now more than 1,300 members around the world, marshaling that expertise to shed light on forest livelihoods governance issues. So I'd love to talk with you about that. Okay, where are we with knowledge about conservation funding? I mean, I think it's like a basic point. Right, for the set up professional audio and audio settings. I don't know if you can see, but obviously I skipped the slide about why conserving biodiversity is important. I assume we can agree on that and imagine, but also that it costs money. And I think this is something we over, and I've tried to think about like, well, why? Planning, advocating for conservation, all kinds of different forms of it, engaging with stakeholders, quote unquote, obviously doing that, enforcing the rules, research, monitoring, and evaluation, and then education and training are some of the things that just cost money to do. So this is the latest source that I could find. We're not doing very well at funding conservation. According to the kind of higher end estimates, we're looking at close to $1 trillion needed globally, with only 208 billion currently spent. So a huge, huge gap. But money is important, obviously, and the limited funds that there have been pretty effective from a biodiversity perspective. This is work that my colleague Anthony Waldron and I led now from before the pandemic, but I think the same, I'd love to update it actually. We found of all the predictors that we looked at in a model of funding effectiveness, that the most important one was conservation investment, and that really reduced biodiversity loss across these 109 countries. So yeah, big questions still remain. We know it's important. How well spent is it? Efficiency kinds of questions. Is it effective? Can we update some of those numbers? Synergies and trade-offs with socioeconomic goals. Under what conditions can we have our cake and eat it too? And then something that I guess it's a product of getting older, but long-term impacts. And this is something that the Ostrom workshop, I think, is known for. Just thinking about sustainable governance and long-term effects. But I think in the policy world, it's so fast. There's kind of a serial faddism that there's not very many over time, long-term studies. And as a result, you don't really know that much about like how could funders more effectively intervene. When I was sitting at that table at MacArthur, I just kept thinking okay, so we're trying to figure out who to fund. Like, what happens when the MacArthur funding is gone? Like they get more or from somewhere else? Do the effects kind of attenuate and fade away? Do they ramp up somehow? So these are the kinds of questions that we still don't have good answers to. And they're more important than ever in an environment where support, particularly in low and middle income countries, our earlier work showed just how important bilateral aid was for conservation in those countries. So we have RIP, USAID, which has had ripple effects through the whole aid system with bilateral aid agencies from different countries reallocating their funds mostly to military purposes in Europe and elsewhere. So huge changes there. And we're already seeing some of this. This is like a year ago, right? And I was just in the Amazon in Peru, which I'll talk about in a moment, in November, and seeing some of the impact of that funding on projects literally shuttered. So at the same time, there's this kind of churning, and this was happening before anyway, but a growing importance of philanthropy, and I'm like super interested in that group. So Rebecca Gruby and some others and I published a special issue in Conservation Science and Practice on this issue. We'll have a piece coming out in the annual reviews, hopefully next year, on conservation, philanthropy, and environmental governance. Philanthropy and environmental governance. So really important. At the same time, indigenous peoples and local community advocacy has been very effective, I would say. There's a lot more to go, but just growing recognition of local community rights and their role in all of this. So lots of kind of uncertainty. So I think these results are interesting in that context. So this is work led by Katya Nakamura, who is now the associate director of FLAIR. She's a Peruvian citizen and knows the Amazon very well. And Kathy Bayless, who's an economist at UC Santa Barbara. So what we were interested in is this question of both the environmental and the social impacts of protected areas. And these are protected areas of all different kinds, which I'll get to, across the different IUCN categories of use. And then what hasn't been done as much is to look specifically at the role of funding in shaping those impacts. So much of the research until now has kind of treated protected areas as a black box that just generate effects. And we're trying to open up that box a little bit. This is a quantitative study to look at one dimension, which is funding. And then looking at the synergies and trade-offs. So this is Peru. Let's skip ahead. Obviously, a global conservation priority. The country of Peru, it's a mega diverse country. 21% of the legally gazetted Amazon is under some form of protection, so it's a large area. It's also very important in Peruvian government strategies for development, et cetera. And of course, there's a tension there, which we could see with the price of gold, for example, going through the roof and mining in different parts of the country, including for a green energy transition mineral. So very interesting kind of dynamic space. And so there's a lot of variation. Where I was recently was in Pacayasa Media up here. But in the south of Peru, near the border with Bolivia, it's very different sorts of dynamics. So interesting context to study. We used a quasi-experimental research design to look at almost all of the protected areas in the Peruvian Amazon. There's 34, but 5 there was very little data for. What you'll see in a moment, we use census data. And there's some areas that just, you have uncontacted indigenous peoples, and reasons we weren't able to include them in the study. The period was looking at funding in 2009. We chose that year because it's the year that the Peruvian government issued a new strategy that really emphasized protected areas in a different way and allocated significant resources. So there's a real shift in 2009 in terms of the funding levels for protected. For deforestation, we looked at 1 kilometer grids inside the protected areas and then compared to legal grids without legal protection outside. And then for the socioeconomic dimensions, we looked at households living close, so 50 kilometers. We looked at different levels of closeness. We can talk about that separately, but 50 versus those living further away. And then this summarizes actually the protected areas where we do the research and where the households are. So the households are in the little dots for a treatment one, and then a plus for control. You can see the buffer zones, and then the shading denotes the amount of funding that was given. So the darker the area, like Cordillera Azul here, received relatively more funding than those that are lighter in color. And then for the outcomes, we use the rate of forest loss per grid for these years with data from the government of Peru baseline of 2010. And we had that baseline to allow for a lag from the funding data, which is 2009. And then on the socioeconomic side, the baseline is 2007, which is when the census was conducted prior to the treatment or the shift in funding. And then 2017, so after the. And we looked not only at monetary income, but the Peruvian National Survey had also non-monetary income, which was great. Obviously, potentially really important to Amazonian households and communities, deriving income or livelihood support directly from the forest, not in a cash-based way. So this idea of protection is long. I mean, there's been a lot of econometric analyses of the effect of protection, but not as much on funding. We're trying to figure out just analytically how to do this. And so I'll tell you a little more. It has been a long time brewing. But what's important about the funding piece is we looked not only at all funding, and so Katya, for her master's thesis, where she worked with me, compiled this data set, and it's so painstaking to get funding data, which is part of the reason why we have relatively little studies on it. It's like such a pain in the ass for the French. So she just and got funding data from all sources, from Peruvian government, from World Bank, from MacArthur, all different possible sources, and then attributed it spatially to protected areas, a given protected area where possible. But what she also did is separated the funding out as strict or mixed. So strict funding is funding that really would have conservation per se as the goal, and mixed funding integrated a development component explicitly. Happy to talk more about that, but so she separated out this, and the reason for doing that is we might expect better human welfare outcomes from funding that actually tries to do that, as opposed to funding that was for.
Maybe.
Hear me out. Hear me out. We might. So, but a lot of the research just looks at it as an aggregate. And so I would love if we had better data on this. It's really a kind of direction to move in. Anyway, so we separated it out. We controlled for 20 different covariates, which you can see here, and I won't mention all of them. And then we used a causal forest analytical approach, which is something that was new to me and interesting to learn. And maybe some of you are experts in it and can help us think it through as well. But really interesting way to try to get at the conditional average treatment effects. And we tried more traditional approaches, and it was impossible to get good matching to make it work. And then this context is so diverse in different ways, including on the outcome. Lots and lots and lots of pixels have no change. So this approach is particularly promising for what we want to do. I'm happy to say a little bit more about it maybe in the Q&A. But we use a so-called honest approach, where to build the trees, we used a separate data from the data that we ultimately analyzed. And then this is, I think, the first use of this approach in this context. And so I'm excited about that for looking at the environmental and socioeconomic effects of protected areas. So a big contribution is using this approach for that particular topic, but also taking the additional step of looking at the funding. Okay. What did we find? This is a good news story. Generally, I think we can use that these days. But we found this 0.21% reduction in deforestation, which when we found it, I was like, oh, okay, that's not very exciting. Like, what does that really mean? But it's significant, right? Compared to the similar amount of observed deforestation. So effectively, the funding the protection effectively prevented loss of twice as much forest cover. And then we translate it into kilometers squared. So, a good, I would say, positive and decent effect size. And then we looked for funding. So here you see total protected area funding here and mixed protected area funding on the right with the conditional average treatment effect on avoided deforestation. And the dots are the different protected areas. They're also coded by deforestation risk level from relatively low, which would typically mean they were far from roads or human settlement, to high, which meant they were close to roads and human settlement. And I was just in the El Pajuayo Mishana one. I had to visit there. That was the reason that I went to the Amazon this last trip, as I was wondering what is going on with this outlier. It turns out that I could have known from looking at the map as well, but it's very close to Iquitos, the largest city in the Peruvian Amazon. And I met one of the kind of founders of it and heard the backstory of how it got declared a park, but under tremendous stress from development. So what you can see here is greater funding, in a slight way, if you drew a straight line, is associated with better outcomes. But there seems to be this peak at about $4,500 per kilometer squared, which is interesting. And then on the mixed funding side, you see that more funding generally is associated with better outcomes. So that was an interesting finding. On the socioeconomic side, we also more tentatively, but we found that households living near did better in terms of annual net income. I was surprised that the non-monetary income gains were a lot smaller, but that's again on average. But when we looked by protected area, here the total funding it was not significant or just weakly positive, but mixed funding, in line with that obvious hypothesis from before, is associated with better socioeconomic outcomes. So we also did a kind of basic trade-off analysis. The effective net income going up, higher the better, and then on deforestation, better deforestation to the right. There were no protected areas to the left of to the negative side of avoided deforestation. So all the protected areas had positive impacts, but a couple of them had negative socioeconomic ones. So there were trade-offs in certain contexts. If and when I can go back, I would be very interested to go to those areas and try to understand more. I think this is a first cut at some of this work, and it needs to be complemented with on the ground and additional research. So just to conclude this piece, I'm doing okay on time, okay. So yeah, basically we find that areas were effective in their conservation goals, and particularly those that were exposed to greater deforestation risk, and generally seem to have had positive socioeconomic impacts, with some exceptions, and that we find that funding makes a difference to all of that. And then mixed funding in particular. So, all right, this is the kind of tentative part. So I mentioned that MacArthur project, and this is like the question that I would love to kind of think through. I think what I've just presented to you allows you to not fully sink your teeth into the topic to answer this question, but I'm sure you have other experience that might help. But there might be some insights from it. And, how can external actors like MacArthur or others intervene in a way that leads to just, effective, and long-enduring conservation outcomes? And so we are wrapping up this study funded by MacArthur that I mentioned, which in addition to Peru had case study with local collaborators in Madagascar and Bhutan. And we used other methods. The main thing that we did across the three countries was look at capacity development and try to, as a kind of key aspect that funders could support capacity development for local communities, NGOs, governments, etc. Um, and there's surprisingly not a ton of literature on this important topic of capacity development, particularly from the perspective of practitioners and communities on the ground. Like, what did they think they would need to do what they would like to do better? And so we used a Q methodology, um, had workshops, interviews, etc. In the three case study countries. And I thought I was going to run out of time, so I didn't actually put all of those results here. But just to say, this is part of a bigger study where we're trying to get at that question. And part of the impetus, or I going to the literature to try to be able to answer it. And so these are well familiar to this crowd, of course. But where does external funding fit in these? And so clearly, I mean, maybe we could think about where external funding is used. I mentioned, for example, enforcement, it probably kind of fits in these in different ways. But this is where it seemed most relevant. Basically, let the communities figure it out. I'm thinking of the Maine lobster cases and so many others where community members were able to kind of figure out a sustainable way, and that's actually respected by outside authorities. So that one, and then maybe here has to do with external actors as well when you think about nested governance. But like, what should that actually look like? Like, what are principles for bringing a bag of money into such a context? And should that be done? It's being done, whether by funders or business or others, right? Communities are not isolated typically, and so there's this kind of integration. So of course, there's lots of tools from the Ostrom workshop and others to try to think about it. But again, specifically, where do funders fit this, for example, which I know has been updated, but yes, it has to do with the action situation, who the actors are. These are some of them, how they're interacting. But what are specific kind of principles or lessons for how donors and others might intervene? Clark Gibson, Esther, Lynn, and Sujay also have a book about aid, which was very influential for me. This aid octangle, they call it. I'm not sure that went very far beyond this book. It's hard to kind of get an analytical purchase. I mean, it directs you to where you might look. I think it needs to be updated. So this is like all a great setup with not a good answer. That's why we're here, right? So I've been trying to think about this, and this is my not good answer that we can kind of talk with. But people, places, and policies and time. I think that's kind of time dimension. As I mentioned, the long term, we don't have a lot of evidence, I think, to help us think through that. So I feel like this idea of conservation legacies, that there's a need to understand not only the legacy that any given intervention might itself generate moving forward in time, but to generate a better legacy, it would need to understand the previous legacies. And I think much of development from my own experience, certainly at the World Bank, understanding of history and the legacies of what came before. There is research on it, and they do try to take it into account, but I think they could do a lot better job of doing that. but sort of more insistently taking stock of the past and what that might mean for the design of interventions, I think is really where we need to go. And then somehow shifting the incentives to be able to monitor, evaluate, and learn over the long term. Again, so very challenging given the incentives of all those actors in the octangle, not least politicians. So I'm afraid that's the end. And so for now, but I hope it seeds the ground for some discussion. And I want to thank really my collaborators on the MacArthur Project, most of whom are sitting here. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to chatting. Help us out.
Thank you. All right, so keeping with tradition, first question should come from a grad student, and I will try to keep a queue, as well as an eye in the online chat, right?
Thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, I have a question regarding your first section, first part. I was wondering, how did you measure the deforestation in your experiment? And my second question is that when you figured out, deforestation is 0.2%, how long, it passed from the policy that enacted in that area? How long was after?
So that's a panel data analysis. The first year, so the treatment being the big increase in funding in 2009. And so the first year after where we looked at outcomes was 2010, and then each year after that. And then aggregated up to be the 0.21%. And then the deforestation is, this is Katya's specialty. I'm like so happy to work with really talented remote sensing people. But she used data from the Peruvian government. And so it's forest loss per 1 kilometer squared pixel aggregated to each individual PA and then aggregated up to form a total for the year.
Do you know if it would be NDVI still or something more than that?
Sorry. Beyond that,
I was just curious.
yeah, good question. If it's, I don't remember if, because we just published a paper on forest covered data sets, global, but this one is not one of those. It's the, yeah, it's forest covered data, and I'm not sure if NDVI or what the metric is, but it's from the Peruvian government, so I know less about it. My apologies.
I think I have Patricia. Oh no, I have Claudia, then Patricia, then Annie, and then Gustavo.
Thank you, Dan, for the presentation, and it is related to the previous question. And it was about how actually the government assesses deforestation. So you explained that this is by 1 kilometer squared.
Yeah.
Well, I have one colleague, a very brilliant colleague that I'm sure that you will love to talk to him. His name is Nelis Shanti, and he did the same study, but in Brazil. And what he found is that farmers in Brazil became so smart in knowing that the satellites that the government was using was capturing 1 kilometer squared deforestation patches. So what they started doing was, instead of deforesting the whole 1 kilometer, they were doing small patches across all the region because that wouldn't be detected by the satellite. So he did the study. He has amounts of data, but he collected the data from a different satellite that is in the European Union. And he compared the measurements from that satellite versus the Brazilian satellite. And he found a complete mismatch in terms of deforestation. So yeah, you don't see the 1 kilometer square pixel, but you see just small patches. So I wonder how that behavior course also could be replicated in the Peruvian case.
Thank you. That is fascinating. I have never heard of that study. So probably it's Copernicus data, I'm guessing the
Yeah, no, I can
EU one.
connect you, I can connect
He
you with him.
compared, or
Yes,
maybe you know
he
more.
compared. So it is the forestation patches map.
Huh?
And that this is using the data from the European Union. I don't remember exactly what is the institute that has the data, but impressive data analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good, I think it leads to a suggestion for us, which is to check the results using a different forest cover data set to see if they're robust to that. So that's, I think in the Peruvian case, the drivers of deforestation, I guess, are, I mean, some of them are similar. But I guess I'm not expecting that kind of savvy
Behavior.
because of the policy environment. But that's in the Peruvian side, but I could be wrong. It's very interesting to think about. What's the name of the?
English Shanti. I will write it down and I will connect you with him.
Actually just forwarded this talk to him.
Okay.
As we came in here, so he's aware, but I think that was.
Okay.
Yeah, he's from India, but he speaks Portuguese very well.
I think we had Patricia next.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I think when we discuss about these conservation issues and this funding, I mean, I used to think who wants conservation, and how we can shift this funding from conservation to, for instance, management or other type of policies. So I would like to ask you about these local policies, if you have seen or how it is related, like, for instance, policies related to centralization or decentralization when the 90s, for instance, when they decided that, okay, we are not gonna work more on conservation, but more on management. Yeah, this is my first question. And the second is, what specific activities people is funding, I mean, for conservation? I mean, what means conservation in the practice? What the people used to do, or the institutions, organizations?
Great questions. So for the first one, yeah, obviously there's potentially a lot of variation in how decentralized governments how their policies might affect agriculture and socioeconomic outcomes. So we tried to control for that in the analysis by basically having a kind of dummy variable. So we don't have a lot of, we don't have more detailed information about the reason for any differences at that level, but we tried to capture or account for that in the model. And then in terms of the 90s policy shift, obviously would make a difference, and perhaps there have been subsequent policy shifts, but our analysis starts in 2009, and I think that's our argument is that there was a big shift in 2009 with the National Environmental Strategy and for how it emphasized protected areas in particular and sought to fund them. So our argument is about that being kind of the key shift from before to after, but clearly, and there would be potential shifts that took place earlier than that. And then, yeah, what is the funding? So yeah, we'll definitely make the data public. And I've worked with conservation funding data for a long time now as someone who was one of the people at the World Bank that had to code the projects. And actually that's better practice than most places. Most places just say conservation or very, very simple description. Maybe they'll have a title of the project with an abstract, and that's if you're lucky. So a lot of data we couldn't really say too much about, and had to make some assumption. But for example, mixed funding would be things like payments for ecosystem services, where communities are paid to support conservation, community-based tourism type initiatives, or those initiatives where communities are explicitly part of the management and enforcement. So anything we could find that involved a human development aspect, broadly construed, would have fallen in our mixed category, but a lot of them had to make assumptions. And I think that's part of the argument for trying to do more field research or talking to some of the people who were involved in the different projects to get to understand. But at this level, Peru-wide, over time, it's not possible to do that. So I'm working with some data scientists at the University of Illinois and the Technical University of Dresden to try to develop ways to use machine learning and natural language processing to automate some of what has been a pretty brute human effort that graduate students are tortured doing, including poor Katya. So that shows some promise, but it's also a political problem of getting funders, particularly as we move into philanthropy being a bigger source of funding. The accountability mechanisms and structures for philanthropy are incredibly limited compared to, for example, the World Bank or more public institutions, which report a lot more detail on the different projects. So when I was working at the World Bank, I was involved in a project, or the TTL, the task team leader, the leader of the project. You have to say, it's kind of back of the envelope, like how much was for gender, how much was for poverty, how much was for climate. And so I would tick an amount up, 20%, 40, 40, whatever, which is better. I mean, you could try to look at the actual budget, but it's hard to tease it out, even if you had those information. So this remains a real barrier, I think, not only in this work where we're trying to be very explicit about what we did and then what the limitations are, but much more generally to kind of track the money. And I guess, so much of what has happened in the US government and internationally in the last year has caused me to just rethink or think about the foundations of some assumptions that I've had about how things work. Like my broad statement, but just accountability and or the lack of it, and how to demand it and ensure that it's there. Like, what are the ways in which we can, as citizens, as taxpayers, I mean, all the taxpayers of the world contribute in some sense to the World Bank and some of the other institutions, how to ensure greater transparency with the flows of money. And I feel like following the money is just so important to do, but it's also just so challenging. So I don't know if that's anyway. Long answer. Thank you.
All right, we have a long list. I'm gonna just go through it so everybody knows that they're on it. We have Annie and Gustavo, a clarifying question from Diana, and then Guangqing, and then Patricia, and then Claudia, and then another one on Paolo, and then I do. That's a long list so far. So we got a while. Annie and then Gustavo. Let's start there.
Sit
I have a fast researcher question.
Okay.
Just very simply, did the shape of those curves change if you just plot them by the funding source? So whether this is ES scheme, Peruvian government, private philanthropy, and the shape of those curves change. That's my practical question. And then my question is, I was like, I'm on the executive committee of a philanthropy called the Agroecology Fund. And so I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the effective funding. And I'm like, there's the hypothesis: build on legacies, local control, support to scale up to district levels. And I was just wondering if you're like, hey, what is the hypothesis for this funding? Is it we leverage philanthropic funding to get larger chunks of public money? We've seen that work, right? Is it actually where we see effective funding is if it's doing the Ostrom kind of things 7 and 8 in that list, right? If it's actually unlocking those things, or actually what we actually see effective funding is local institution building and local institution strengthening. And so I have like some skepticism about like protection as a category or chunks of money as a category, because I've seen, and I'm sure you have, just money just thrown into the wind in the development world. So I would love to just, you can talk to me for the next 4 hours on that sort of hypothesis about how do you go about measuring what is effective funding, and especially in really different sociopolitical contexts.
Okay.
And now there's too many people, so like
That will take 4 hours.
ask a question and maybe there will be some echoes you can answer a lot of at once.
Yeah. I mean, just a fantastic question that I wish I had better answers to, but I think you're getting at some of the elements of the answers. But the first one, the shape of the curves, where they change. So unfortunately, I wish we could classify the funding by like there is an IUCN classification for funding. So in the Bhutan case study, we, and all 3 countries actually, we mapped the funding flows by 8 different IUCN conservation action categories. So they have this kind of action category. But we did it for Bhutan and we did it for Madagascar, but not for Peru. So we don't have that fine 10 level. But I think that's the level at which we would try to do separate it out. Unfortunately, all we have for Peru is the strict versus mixed, which isn't terribly helpful. And then even if we had it at a finer grain, the amounts are actually relatively small. And I think we'd have a lot of zeros, like a lot of like a given action just wouldn't have been tried at a given protected area, that maybe more remote one compared to one closer to a city. They just wouldn't use the same approach. And so you wouldn't a lot of zeros. So, but I think that's an interesting idea to, I mean, maybe in the Bhutan and Madagascar case, we can be a little bit more fine-grained in doing that. So that's the easy one. I feel like the second one, so there's 2 different aspects to it. One is all funding is not the same. So you said you're working with philanthropy. We thought at the very beginning of this project, we developed a kind of typology of funders, because I think you might expect different funders to play a different kind of role depending on the accountability mechanisms, like how much reporting they need to do, the flexibility that they have. And generally, philanthropy is very high on doing whatever the heck it as long as the board of the foundation is okay with it, they can do just about anything within the law. Compared to the World Bank or USAID or bilaterals, which are government funders and have a lot more reporting requirements, and it's just the band of what they can do is narrower. On the flip side, they have a lot more money in a lot of the cases, although when you start talking about the founder of Amazon, having a lot of money, the Bezos Earth Fund and others, I mean, these are getting toward the level of bilateral, multilateral aid in some cases. So we thought about funders as like a leveraging, of sustaining, of innovating. So we might be able to think, and we didn't write that up, but I think your question is making me think that we should, to try to think through and bring some analytical clarity to what we might, like develop hypotheses about what we might expect from different types of funders. So that's one aspect, is like the range of funders and funder types. And then in terms of what might work better, is it local capacity? Is it building? I think I simply don't have a pat answer for that one. It would require a lot of further discussion, but I do think there's a reason why we chose capacity development broadly construed as one of the areas, but that could be relating to local communities, their capacities, creating a kind of enabling environment for them to pursue their own solutions in a broader context. But also could be government, university, science, the kind of science background, all of this. So capacity development is potentially quite wide ranging, and you'd have to, again, do something probably like that aid octangle to get into identify the different actors that would be part of the system. And then different funders will be able to intervene differently in that. The other piece is sustainable financing. We had a part of the work that was about trust funds, which I think are still potentially, there's the potential to be more kind of Ostromian. Yeah, is that the word? I don't know, you all would probably use it. But in being responsive to needs within a particular country, of course they would be, the national level will be subject to politics, etc. But there's the potential that they could be a source for being more responsive to needs, diverse needs over time and in different places within the country. You could probably for those 4 hours that you mentioned, but that might not be interesting for everyone. Okay.
Right, thanks. Gustavo.
Okay, yep, a very cool presentation. I have like two set of comments. So one more particular, thinking about the results on incomes of households' income. So exactly what is the mechanism is these projects are big enough to produce changes in the incomes of the local communities. If not, exactly what is the mechanism? Because I know it sounds, whatever it's, I'm kind of lost exactly what is driving that thing. Connected to that is like, you might also think about the trade-off from, so I understand where you're coming from. You're coming from, I care about deforestation and I don't want to generate a social problem trying to fix deforestation. But still from the perspective of the founder, there might be a different trade-off, okay? So let's say I want to reduce poverty and I send checks, just pure transfers. I would be reducing poverty more. So if I care about poverty and deforestation, I have a different trade-off, even if I'm not impacting negatively poverty when I am doing something to treat deforestation. So that's probably something to kind of think about. Is like compared to a benchmark, what would change in income you would be expecting if it's just this is a pure transfer, you just send checks and that's it, no? Second set of comments is more related to the general things that you talk at the end of the presentation. Is like how to connect this with the Ostromian principles, the design principles. It's so, and I was thinking about like two ways of attacking that problem. Is so one is like, well, the founders are targeting places in which the principles are failing. Okay, otherwise they're not going to be an issue. No, that's one possibility. The other possibility is like, no, this is working up to what the local community wants, but the founders want something different, so they are trying to flip the incentive to move away from the Ostromian local level to something else. Okay, so maybe thinking through those lens could, it's a good. It's another perspective on how to connect with the principles and the Ostromian local institutions. Okay.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I love the idea of just thinking from orthogonally or from a different perspective on these two aspects. So on the mechanisms, again, that would be great if we could get more at that. We have to infer from the data that we have about what was actually funded. But we also have the literature to give us some hypotheses about what might have been going on. That's why I was surprised that non-monetary income actually was not more. I would have thought that those gains were due to non-monetary income, frankly, in a lot of the cases, but it was a small proportion. And so that, made us think what could it be? I think we need to say more about that in the paper, but jobs are one possibility related to the park. And would be the case that certain protected areas might generate more jobs than others. And so there's going to be wide variation. Some of them have very few employees yield. So there's a job story, I think, and it could also relate to ecotourism. Again, some protected areas and then not others. But just there's a whole economy around tourism, from restaurants, guides, transportation, that can create local economic benefits. So those are a couple. I don't think there were too many like direct payments. So we've done a literature review recently with a former workshopper and Eduardo's student, Sasha Siani, who's working with me as a postdoc. And we looked at cash transfers and unconditional cash transfers. For environmental, there are very few cash transfer projects. I don't think we found any that were looking at the environmental outcomes of those. Like to your second point, cash transfers, unless they're unconditional cash transfers, there's not typically an environmental story that people are wanting to tell, but there certainly would be environmental impacts. And so we've actually been looking at that in Kenya. If the really well-designed RCT by Ted Miguel and others at Berkeley of a unconditional cash transfer that was fantastically successful in alleviating poverty. But they didn't look at the environmental impacts. And Sasha is using remote sensing to look at the environmental impacts of those. And surprisingly to us, we're finding actually positive impacts on the environment, local environment, at least for forest cover, but that probably has more to do with planting of eucalyptus plantations for a variety of reasons. But we think that in that particular context, cattle are like a moving bank. So a lot of the poverty, cash was used and stored in cattle, which might have had negative impacts on their soil or soil erosion. So we're looking into that. Anyway, your point about kind of taking a different lens and looking, if a funder was interested in poverty per se, would be really interesting to do in that context as well. I'm not sure we would have to collect all the data on the development projects, which we could, but then making it spatially explicit becomes challenging. So that's also an issue in all of this, is the funding that you can trace to a particular geography is not always obvious. But I take your point of trying to look from that other perspective, and that's definitely something that we'll try to do. In terms of the last one, my groping for a framework, yeah, there's a kind of romanticized, idealized, community up in the mountains or way in the forest. But so funders are trying to either it's failing and they want to reverse it, or funders are wanting to change what's happening. Those are two kind of general hypotheses that would be worth kind of thinking through. And the approach, depending on what exists, all of the design principles before the last two, maybe having understanding of that would lead you to have one strategy or another. So taking what's actually there. Anyway, that's thank you. I'd love to chat with you after about that. Thanks.
I'm going to read out Deanna's clarifying question, and then I want Panjing to provide his, and maybe you can answer them both, so we make sure we get everyone.
Yeah, sorry.
No, this is fantastic. But Diana just wanted you to clarify a little bit more about the point that there's not quite enough evidence from the perspective of communities. It sounded like that was something that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And so if you could clarify or offer a little bit more on that, and offer your question.
Yeah, my question is still about the income. So one part of the income could come from the labor migrants. They send money home, the remittance. That depends on the magnitude. That can be a huge factor. So, just hypothetically, if the conservation money, it can backfire, make the local livelihood can get worse. So in the meantime, you could get lots of people left, make money, send home money, and on the number, you still see the income increase. Well, just hypothetically. So I don't know what's the reality, how it works there.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So on that one, just since we were on the topic of income before, that's interesting. I am not remembering if we took into account migration out, but I bet it's something we can look at or with the census data, particularly since there was a change. So that might get to the mechanisms. So I think we might be able to use census data to understand at least the situation of migration. So that's a great point. I'm not sure that there's a lot of money being sent back. Maybe it differs than the Brazilian Amazon, and I'd be curious to know if maybe part of the Brazilian Amazon remittance income is a big thing. So this is people from the cities, right, that have moved and then or that have moved out of the country and are sending money. I'm just not sure. That's something to look into. That's great. I don't know. Do you find that that's a big thing in Brazil? That the flow of income goes back?
To some extent, yes. Not in the sense of migration remittance, more in the sense of the way households organize themselves between rural and urban areas. And so the money flows, within the household unit, which is itself has member working in the city, traveling, also working rural areas part of the time. So we call that multi-sited households. They economically function as a group, but people are in more than one place. That is a very common thing in the Amazon. It's probably one of the dominant ways in which households organize themselves.
And are you getting that from census data ever, or is it from field work?
It's field work. We did the first project. We developed this concept almost 20 years ago. But it's a concept that people keep using and see that same pattern of rural urban mobility and money circulation. So that was it was a kind of an empirical concept that.
Yeah, thanks. We'll definitely look into that. On the first question, hi. The first question, community perspectives and capacity development. So we did our literature review at the very start of this project on the academic literature on capacity development for conservation and what it's saying. And we found, a big finding is there's relatively little on that, despite the fact that it's from a funding perspective, it's like an obvious thing that you would do. So it's very and when I was at MacArthur, World Bank or elsewhere, capacity development is like key to the strategy. And somehow scholars haven't looked at it as much, but there is literature. But what we found is a lot of it was really top down. So kind of conservation scientists saying, oh, we need this. We need a biologist who can, understand this species or maybe sometimes an economist who can do an economic analysis. So, but it was very much like from the government or from conservation science perspective, but rarely in the literature was it from communities, NGOs, local or international kind of conservation practitioners on the ground. And so we did, we held multi-stakeholder workshops, different kinds of practitioners. The only one we were able to do, well, in Bhutan and Madagascar, Peru was during the pandemic, so we did it online, an online kind of Q-sort methodology, where we had the groups identify, we had a list of possible actions and had them kind of prioritize the actions. One of the outputs was a perspective piece from Malagasy practitioners kind of talking to donors and giving suggestions about what they thought the priorities were, which interestingly to me were outside of the conservation sector. So a lot of things that impinge, I mean, obviously on conservation, whoever is leading it, are not solvable from within the sector. So things like corruption, political change, economic demand for high value products are kind of outside of the purview of traditional conservation capacity development. And so they were calling for more attention to those more kind of systemic factors. And so that's what I meant by kind of local perspectives on capacity.
We had Patricia over here.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question and a suggestion. The question is first in terms of design, of research design. The institutions and the policies are a key element in the Ostrom theory. I don't know if I'm taking you a little bit out of the scope, but how did you address, analyze, involve the institutions in Peru? Because the institutions, they are simply weak every year, or they seem to not work at all. I'm Peruvian, so I can speak bad about my own country. So, and I know this. And so it's the rules, the norms basically do not exist, or they are simply very weak. And more so when you move to the rainforest than when you are in the coast. And the second thing I was about to say is a suggestion. In terms of deforestation, probably the main drivers of deforestation in Peru are the drug dealers and the illegal mining, right? The drug dealers in the north, the illegal mining in the west. There is a new technology, and I am aware that you may follow up with this, called the synthetic aperture radar, SAR, SAR. It's handled by the MIT. I believe they can give you a much more accurate proportion of all the deforestation, not only in the Americas, but I think globally.
Yeah. Thank you. It's funny you mentioned that. I just heard of that. I think this is maybe some of you are remote sensing experts, but I was just talking with someone about it was closer to LiDAR. It's not LiDAR, but it could see through clouds. Does somebody know? It's a new technology. It's like SIDAR or something. I don't. I'm not sure if it's this, but it's capable of seeing through clouds, which have been a big barrier for measurement. Yeah, so I think thanks for the suggestion. I think that goes back to the very first question, the idea of maybe validating what we did using data, trying to use a different data set, possibly this one we could use. So thank you for that. In terms of the institutions, I guess I didn't fully understand your question. Did you mean how did we work with institutions in Peru to design yeah, so the FLARE network that I just mentioned, we just had our annual meeting in Lima, which was great, and a number of the people with whom we worked, mostly from the Ministry of Environment. The former Minister of Environment, we actually had 3 former ministers of the environment at the meeting.
That's my point.
So Manuel Pulgar Vidal was the keynote speaker. And so he helped advise us. And then we had someone in the Ministry of Environment who, Marco Arenas, I don't know if you know him, who provided the data. which was very helpful. And then we've kept them kind of abreast of the work and tried to translate it into Spanish. So really our main contact has been the Ministry of the Environment. And then we've drawn from this Encuesta Nacional, but we haven't worked with them specifically. So if you have suggestions for who else we might reach out to, I know things are in flux, but I'd love to chat with you more. Thank you.
All right, I think I have a question from online, Paolo. I'm just gonna read it out if that's okay. Congrats on the presentation. I wonder whether the protected area category, actually protected area, community-led protected area, for example, plays any role in the relationship between funding and deforestation found in the study. Further, in terms of protected areas location, is there any evidence on spillover effects, say a specific well-funded protection area driving positive outcomes in the surrounding protected areas? Really related to spatial autocorrelation, which is a question I had as well. If you look at the clustering of villages, it's almost arbitrary where the buffer line falls. And so I'm curious if sort of spillover.
Yeah, those are really great questions. So as I was presenting, or answering one of the questions, I was thinking about the protected area categories, and I was like, we do that. I know we have it. The latest versions, we've focused really on the funding level, but I think that the IUCN category would be interesting. The problem there is, I mean, I guess we could do it as a continuum, like assuming category 5, which is kind of more use allowed, to strict protection category 1. Maybe we could array them on a continuum as we've done for funding, and see if that matters. We haven't done that, but I think we could, and I like the idea. So thank you for that. On spillovers, we've had so much discussion in our team about this, and just that 50-kilometer buffer. This is the thing of using secondary data that, and for PhD students, I mean, for all of us, like trying to make lemonade out of lemons. The census data, like we really wanted the deforestation analysis, I think, despite some of the suggestions for how we could make it better, is strong and more typical. But we really wanted to get at some of the trade-off questions and have us, layer in the social economic. The only option for doing that, we looked into DHS data, others, but this was the best option. But just because of how population is distributed, it's very sparse in parts of the Amazon, and then therefore the national survey data are very thin. So to be frank, some of the protected areas, like we had a cutoff of there had to be at least 2 or 3 households surveyed around. There are some where there was only 1. And so that caused us to kind of extend the boundary to 50 kilometers for the, but we've done the analysis at 10, 20. We found in the literature there wasn't like a good a priori reason to choose of those or another. We kind of like make up a reason. Like, so if you're 10 kilometers, you can maybe walk to the protected area, or that might be some reason why being that close, or 5 kilometers matters more from a local economy perspective. Hubs, tourism, going out to 50 cents. So I'm not answering your question. We did try to account for those, and I'm forgetting exactly where we landed on how we did that. But it's like a critical issue, and you could see from the map that it's the overlap.
It's a lot.
Yeah, like yeah.
I mean, I think you could almost just like keep all the data, not create the buffer, right? And just this. Yeah, I mean, that would be one, and then the other is just to look at whether there's any additional coefficient plus the household straddled above, or essentially like based on how close they are together.
Mhm.
Right? Is there's sufficient correlation between those spatially proximal? That's even if they straddle the buffer, might give you just something to start to say about that question.
Yes. No, yeah. Thank you. That's good. Yes. Thank you.
You do, and one way back there. No time actually, so.
Thank you, Dan. Great that you were here. So I think most of my questions have been taken one way or another. I was most interested in unpacking the category of funding, to understand where it's going and where maybe applied. So that, you answer a lot of those questions. So some general thing. I was surprised with the data on non-monetary benefits. It was not significant. But is that data, did you design that survey, or you're getting data from the national census? So it may be that data is not capturing non-monetary benefits.
It could be, and we have the specific question that they asked. So it could be that it's not getting at it. I myself have developed and implemented household surveys and asked this question. And I think it is hard when you, like, for households to kind of calculate or put that. It's like a hard question to answer. Like, how much of my income comes from non-monetary sources? Not very little, if any. So I think it's a hard question in general, unless you start asking very specific questions like, do you harvest non-timber forest products? Which one? Do you harvest timber? Do you do X, Y, and Z? That gets you thinking about your activities, but otherwise it's hard to recall them. So there could be something about the nature of the question.
A couple of projects where we're doing this kinds of specific questions, what we are finding is that actually the non-monetary benefits is what is keeping things going. The monetary, because the monetary are of market structural issues. They're always, in deficit. These other opportunities. So the non-monetary benefits is actually the key element, in keeping many activities on the ground. That's why it caught my attention, because
Me too. I that's, and to your earlier point, or maybe it's a migration story. I don't think so, but it could be. But yeah, I would love to understand that better, and I think we need to try to look more specifically into the data and see if we can squeeze out some more insights from the little that we have.
Another, just a general question. You said that the total protected area from deforestation from the analysis was about 300 some square kilometers. What does that mean in relation to the total area that was deforested? Because you know what, and I'll tell you, because we did an analysis that is under review now, including Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, using biosphere reserves, 7 biosphere reserves in those countries, and they do make a difference. So when you do a matching analysis, they make a difference. They have less deforestation significantly, but there's still a ton of deforestation within them and outside it. It's just that there's a little less compared to the total amount. But in terms of effectiveness, you see that the overall system is failing. So that was what is the proportion that represents?
I think we did look into, I think it's quite small, because most of the deforestation is happening outside of the protected areas. So this is getting at the amount that would have been lost within them. So that's just the additional amount given protection. It's not about the whole system.
In terms of the principles, I like the idea and the exercise. My thinking would be, that be less than adding. As I say, what could we add here to speak to this community? And more, how could we use the principles in different phase of funding a project. You know, for instance, as a guide for planning. So what the principle does, you know, it sort of guides you to see where are the key problems here that we're trying to face. You know, the problems of fiscal limits, the problems of social limits, the proportionality between the costs and benefits, the monitoring. So it's sort of a whole checklist, if you will, you know, to try to identify the problems that you're trying to do. The other side of the application is how do you implement funding if you decide to do funding? And I think the principles can help the same way. For instance, you know, funding, what are the physical limits that you want to impact that funding? That's a question. Where we're trying. What is the limits of the social groups that we're trying to get funding to? So it's an exercise for that. You know, what are we funding? In the sense that who's defining what you're funding? So if you look at, you know, the principles in terms of, you know, what is the capacity of the community to make the rules? It's about that too. You know, how do they define what actually needs for funding? Because one of the problems of funding is that the solutions come from the outside. They look great at the beginning because it's a source of funding for as long as it lasts, but the solution itself may not meet needs, the common story. So, you know, maybe instead of adding to those principles, how can we use that, you know, to plan and then to think about the implications of the implementation?
Can I think on that question?
Yeah.
I think it seems like there's sort of different ways of putting the puzzle pieces together here. Like one is like adding another set of principles, and the other is we use these principles to help funding be more effective. But it also seems a little bit possible that the funding could undermine or in some ways pervert the principles in some way, right? Like they change the incentives such that they may not be organically generated, right? So you might put more emphasis on a particular principle that may not have the buy-in of the community members in the first place. And so I'm sort of curious about like, I'm always curious about sort of unintended adverse consequences, but I'm sort of like, that's the best case scenario of like using the principles to think about like how the funding could affect that. But we also know, and I think you mentioned this last night, like once you have funding in a particular place, that creates a kind of inertia, right? And a kind of sort of like, oh, we're doing this now because that's where the funding is, not because that's what needs to have happened. So there's a staticness that happens. So I'm also curious about like the angle at which you are hoping the question of the role of funding is going to intersect.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there is something to be said for the principles as potentially a guide, but I'm not sure that they are expansive enough. And there are pieces of it that there's just not kind of clear guidance, and getting a little bit to what you were just saying. But for example, like peer group resource boundaries, number one, like what are we talking about here? It's just super contentious in a lot of cases. And a funder can fund community mapping efforts. And in fact, we've been working to develop the IFRI approach into an app. And one of the key elements of the app is, managing, mapping the boundaries, which then can create conflict. Lots of conflict over because different claims. So from a funder perspective, like who you fund, if you're funding communities to kind of do that, you could fund, funders do, like fora to try to resolve some of the conflicts that there are, like a way to meet. So I guess it fits under there. I guess we could try to work through each one of these. And then these are communities working together. In many observation approaches, it's the state, right? If you have state-governed protected areas, the funding advice, might not be the same. Maybe it is. So I just think maybe it's a principle by principle thinking, but the last two seem to be explicitly about factors outside the community. And doing this, it's not really clear like how. And it gets to the point I mentioned earlier about capacity development that on the ground practitioners identified things outside of their control. And that's what this is about. So I think it gets us maybe part of the way, but not all the way. And it needs more thinking.
On that note, being the workshop, opportunity for more thinking on that. Noting that it is 1:30, I want to thank Dan for joining us and also invite folks to continue the conversation. But first, thank you. Again, the research series is on Wednesday with Cindy Lott and Bill Bloomquist, and then next week's Monday colloquium will be Scott Page, also actually at University of Michigan then, but at a different time period. So I hope you guys can join us for that as well.
Research series at 1 p.m.
Oh, 1 p.m. Thank you very much. Yes, 1 p.m. on Wednesday. All right, great. Thank you.
Long time.
Yes. How much? The spillover, yeah, no, this is great. I have to look.
Actually,
I actually remember talking. Worked.
But like my last. Yeah, you are. Part two.
Oh, Andrew.
I had the same.
They got an alarm to remind me to speak.
Be here.
Jeez.
Obviously depends on like hydraulic.
Okay, there is no snow, we search for it.
They got it like. A lot of. Okay.
Right, there was a thing there.
In a way, like.
Right?
That areas are.
How you doing?
To see if I can.
No, right?
Other.
Yeah. It's gonna go for the trade-offs. Thursday, About.
Sorry. I have them all.
Still with this whole.
She did a. Even the few studies. When there wasn't there.
I mean, I
Till after survey. After survey have not so.
yeah.
Left the name. Yes, exactly. Because I think not too late.
I sent him a first invitation this morning.
Okay, good.
He's a brand new player here in the field. And he does remote sensing, forestry. He is like. Same guy. Fan.
Well, again,
Too bad he wasn't.
my brain like. I'm.
I appreciate, yeah.
Enjoy your presentation. That was
Super.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. Mr. Gusto, nice to see you. Okay.
yeah. So it's
Yeah.
yeah. So it's a lot of questions. I think that was
Practice.
essentially.
And then I told you.
How about this extra? Thanks.
I have to come see that, yeah, so I've been hiding over there.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be in and out.
Yeah, I think there are different ways of being. So it's a complicated selection on what projects they choose. You know, Mechanisms you're expecting. So then, I think I could thinking what we're presenting so say something more about who runs the protection unit. So most likely, I think what I will talk about the national government.
Any snack left?
Just like
Go get straight for the coffee.
or
The management category.
Oh.
That's what it's about, and these are all done in some sense by the ministry.
I was like.
Various agencies with it. But nevertheless, well, there's a whole bunch. Private areas, some of them are community.
okay, so there is
So
a
there is
variation in terms of
this variation.
Okay. So essentially you also have variation. In some cases, yeah, actions in other cases, private entities or you have a community. Okay. So you have a lot of things going on there, but probably you need to cover everything because start slicing categories you end up with. Yes,
Little power, yeah. I mean, Brazil has a lot.
Curious about
A lot of the studies on these lines have been.
workflows still seem correct? But in hospitals.
So the picture thing but I didn't want to open that question because it's like it's kind of a Pandora box, it's like too big.
Your actors, you can actually.
The areas
Agents.
clear about
But I should sit down and talk to them.
diversity,
Super fascinating.
forestation.
I've done a little bit of it.
It's like you have very poor populations, but there are also areas with very low density level. So at the end, so most of the poor, even if are in urban areas, so essentially it's not that straightforward, just focus on. So again, another way of really justifying your approach is like, well, it's a no damage thing, but that's it. I don't need to go beyond that because if I care about poverty, well, I should be focusing on different areas, different approaches, completely different because most of the poor of those countries are not all okay. So
You can't really.
in some sense, I
Hear about the gold.
it's my sensing of what's going on in many of the organizations, including World Bank, IDB. It's like so to have
Actor.
and then they start expanding the number of goals
And filling code, like, right? Yeah.
have more instruments and those goals. So at the end, I think what's going on is you are asking for things. The monitoring is going to zero because essentially.
I would love to, I like.
So I would prefer to go back to, okay, I target one thing. I will be able to clearly monitor what are the impacts.
So.
And then for the rest, it's not that I don't care.
That's right.
I will go pretty minimal on, I don't know, no huge damage. See.
And now.
Yeah.
And then that's probably one way. It's not very far from
You have.
approach that I sense
Modeling.
of your personality.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you wouldn't really need to.
These are those that maybe,
The level, like, that would be
say like this.
C.
So,
I think it
but
would.
they don't want to end up
Get people.
learning that they are already heavily. Okay, good. So you check that.
It's.
That's it.
I'm in love with the digital.